we don't move forward without our loved ones, right? That the ancestors are the ones that help us move forward. They're right there with us. They're not gone, but they're right with us, whispering in our ears like an inner voice, like an inner guide. And so, whereas the culture I'd grown up in told me to turn my back on my mother and just keep trying to make something of myself, this other culture embraced the idea that the dead are still with us and that they're a very reassuring presence.
Welcome back to another podcast of A Measure of Passion. Today I am thrilled beyond words to be interviewing an author. Rebi Huntman is the author of A Mother in Havana. This is her memoir and I think a dedication to not only her own mother, but I believe to all moms and all mothers out there. And so I want to take this moment to welcome the author and ethicist, Reba, to the podcast. Hi, Rebi.
Hi, Jojy. Thank you so much for having me here to talk about my mother in Havana. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you so much. I have to tell you, as I've mentioned as we are warming up, that what my initial thoughts about this book was, and what it is today after I finished the book, has been two completely different journeys. And so let's start off sort of talking about probably the goal that you had set out for yourself to write a book and dedicated, I think, to motherhood and your mother and mothering and all those things. But what it started out and where the journey took you when you traveled to Cuba and to the different locations there as you were seeking out the essence of your mother. Please walk us through that.
Oh, goodness. Yes, please. I'd like to say first and foremost that this journey has been many decades in the making. And so what drew me to Cuba was to find my mother, who is not Cuban and neither am I. So in order to introduce the story and what eventually drew me all the way to Cuba to find my mother, I lost my mother when I was 19 years old, and I was a sophomore in college, just starting out that second year. And, I felt utterly bereft. I'd been very, very close to my mother, and I didn't really know how to grieve, and I had difficulty finding any models for how to grieve in the circle around me. I grew up in the Midwest here in the U.S. I was in college, just outside Chicago, and very well-meaning college counselors and other adults offered the advice to keep moving, right? Don't think about your mother. It's time to make your own life, make your mother proud, focus on your exams, keep moving forward. And I took that advice to heart, and I spent 30 years moving forward and trying to make my mother proud. And I worked, very hard at several careers, one of which was a career in Latin dance and choreography, and really trying to make something of myself. And in the process, over those 30 years, I really lost my mother. I lost any sense of her. I didn't stop missing her. I missed her profoundly, but all that not thinking about her meant that I lost the really precise details of who she was, the sound of her voice or the feel of her skin. All of those things really evaporated. And then when I was about to turn 50, I found myself missing her more profoundly than ever, and in a way that I suspected even then had something to do with being a woman myself, almost the age my mother was when she died. And really finding that being on the cusp of 50 was not how I thought it would be. I had thought I would feel really grown and self-possessed and, like a real badass of a woman in the world, because 50 had always seemed like, if you didn't have it together by then, when would you? And I felt, rather than feeling those things, although I think to the outside world they would have suggested or thought that maybe I did feel that way, inside I felt like that 19-year-old girl that had lost her mother and that missed her. And as I was looking around, I felt myself both yearning to connect with my mother, really missing her, and also looking for a role model as to how to feel like that more grown, self possessed version of myself. And I knew a couple things about Cuba because I had been there before as a dancer and a choreographer. And I had traveled to Havana starting in 2004 to work with fellow choreographers there. And in that time there, I knew two things about that culture. And one was amongst the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions like Santeria, the idea is that we don't move forward without our loved ones, right? That the ancestors are the ones that help us move forward. They're right there with us. They're not gone, but they're right with us, whispering in our ears like an inner voice, like an inner guide. And so, whereas the culture I'd grown up in told me to turn my back on my mother and just keep trying to make something of myself, this other culture embraced the idea that the dead are still with us and that they're a very reassuring presence. And the second thing I knew about Cuba from my experience dancing there was that the mother is so boldly celebrated. She has such an important central role both within the biological family and within the spiritual traditions of the whole nation. Within the Catholic tradition, there's the patron saint of Cuba, Our Lady of Charity. And then in the Afro-Cuban traditions, you have all kinds of mother goddesses, including Oshun, the river goddess, who is syncretized with Our Lady of Charity. And so in my grief, in my wondering at that crucial time, about to turn 50, what does it mean to be a woman and a mother in the world, and how do I connect with my mother who I ache for so deeply but don't remember? And so if I don't remember her, what is it that I'm aching for? I went to Cuba to find the answers.
I mean, it is such a beautiful story, and I was really touched by also how your nuclear family, your father also responded to the expectations of a woman and what being a mother and a wife meant in terms of societal expectations. And so there was some like rigidity around what it meant and the sacrifices that your mom made to be the woman he expected from her. And as an extension, what that led you and your sisters to also partake in terms of societal expectations. And so I do think that that also came alive in your book, because it talked about how not only did your professors and not anybody wanting to harm you, but try to help you stay focused and keep moving and invest in the future, but there was also this family expectation that you weren't going to, and you use the word a lot in the book, hysterical, and that you keep your emotions together and that you have a certain respect or a stiff upper lip, which I know that some families at times of grief also do. I have lost both my parents at this point in my life, and I remember when my father passed away, my mother was hysterical, and I had never seen my mom that way personally. She wasn't necessarily a woman who was a reserved individual, but I had never seen her quite that emotional. And even at that time, I was 36 at that time, and I thought to myself, is my mom putting on an act? Like, what is this? I've never seen her act like this before. And it was the unknown for me, but it was also a little frightening because my mother had always been a very strong person. And then I also got afraid of loss, because if loss does this to you, I'm not sure I want to be like that. And so there were all these ranges of emotions that was going through me, which was very different than your experience of grief. But I don't know if you want to speak at all about your family's expectations about how you react to that, and how there's a different way to honor your mom, and it wasn't to be emotional. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, I love that question. One of the things about this book, My Mother in Havana, is that it braids together the spiritual journey with some of these more feminist, themes and questions, and it is a memoir. So I'm talking about myself and my personal experience growing up with what you described very well as being some very rigid ideals, both for my mother and then for the daughters of the family, myself and my sisters, about how to be a woman. And there was always a message of, there was the good way to be and then the wrong way to be, right? And you had to be very careful to always choose the right way. And the right way seemed to be all the ways that would lead us to be pleasing and not outspoken, and certainly not, that word hysterical is really important. It comes from the word for the womb, and it came from doctors that thought that women's emotions were a dysfunction of the uterus, and for my father, that was one of the worst things he could say about a woman, was that she could be hysterical. And I really followed that. Again, in my grief, I never wanted to make other people uncomfortable. I don't think I'm alone in this. On the one hand, we're talking about women and how we're raised, but I think in patriarchal culture in general, we're afraid of emotion, right? Those are kinds of we push those to the side, and we mistrust them, or they terrify us, right? But that intuitive emotional sense really belongs, to the feminine, and it's our birthright, right? To really feel things deeply. And I was not allowed to feel things deeply when my mother died. I felt like I had to put on a face. I would be, for example, if I was dating someone and the subject of my mother came up, I would likely start crying, and then that would make the person uncomfortable, or among my friends. So there's this real sense in both my personal journey, but I think in the wider culture, where we have this distrust of emotions and we turn away from them. And one of the things that this journey to Cuba did for me was it really reset that and reoriented that. So, you'd asked earlier, what happened when I got to Cuba, and what were some of the ways that I sought to connect with my mother. And I spent, I spent time in Havana, immersing myself in the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions like Santeria, that really keep the dead close and honor the ancestors. And some of the rituals and initiations, that I witnessed included, animal sacrifices. And one of the things that confronted, or brought up in me was the idea of, this is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable for me to watch this, but I need to watch, right? This is part of life, in those spiritual traditions, the idea of animal sacrifice is this idea of opening up an energy portal, between worlds, and the animal makes its, sacrifice in order to be able to call the spirits and the gods forth. And so to be able to sit with that, right, and that discomfort, I attended pilgrimages 10,000 strong to celebrate, the spiritual mother. And I met with a spiritist who channels the spirits of the dead, and asked him to summon my mother. And through it all was this vein, or this through line of really appreciating that veil, that thin veil between life and death, really forcing myself to look at that straight on rather than avoiding it, as I felt like my culture had always taught me, don't look at death, don't talk about it, don't say your mother's dying, even though she is, right? Mm-hmm. Pretend like everything's okay. There was this real sense of just sitting with life in all of its messiness and its beauty, that I think is a really, really important part of this journey.
Yep, and I agree. And I think that was the part that resonated with me. And I guess the word I can use to most describe it is honoring. Honoring the life of the animals who are opening that channel for you by their sacrifice, and being able to observe that state of transition, as well as, when your mom was dying, and honoring her life and her transition and her death, and the fact that you were given the message, and I think in the book you actually use the phrase, you turned your back, to that. And that, I think, is what a lot of people do as a way to escape, cope, not deal with the reality, but then having to go through that spiritual process to try to, to get in touch with your mom again. You now had to look that sort of right in the eye and deal with it as a way to access that. And so, like I said, the best word I could come up is honoring the passing of your mom, and finally going back and retracing your footsteps, where you were 19 years old and you didn't know how to do it, but with the support of your spiritual guides, you were able to do it differently this time around. I really found it to be very beautiful and very sacred. As we had talked about before we started, I'm also raised in the Catholic faith, and my mom, and I think Indian Catholics are very much like Mexican or Spanish Catholics that are very pious and very religious, and but a little bit differently, that my mom, who was the more religious of the two in my family, was very specific about not going beyond, the faith, and going to, there was a time in my life, and I smile because, part of my tradition was having an arranged marriage, because there are so few Catholics who are Indian in this country, that my parents were very determined to have me have an arranged marriage so that they could keep the culture and the faith intact. And so during my college years, I went to every, clairvoyant, tea reader, they offered it, palm reader. I went to every single person who could tell me that not doing the traditional arranged marriage was going to be my path. And even though they gave me mixed information about that, I still wanted to fight that tradition in me. But over the years, I've actually met a clairvoyant that I really think is the real deal. That's somebody that I think has helped shed some light in certain ways. My parents always present when I'm there. And they connect more with my daughter than they do with me, to be honest with you. But that's still reassuring. That doesn't bother me at all. But I think that sort of something that my mom never really appreciated, maybe was more afraid of than anything else. It did challenge, I think, her religious beliefs, versus, and I think was reminiscent of a Hindu tradition, maybe something that she didn't want to believe in, because we've been Catholic for so many generations. I don't know exactly all the reasons why that was, but I have definitely gone down that path myself, for moments of relief that I have found myself in that journey as well. What I also found really remarkable about your time in Cuba were all the mothers that you found. And I am embarrassed not to try to replicate the words, because I don't want to not say them correctly. But there was the river goddess, there's Our Lady of Charity, and there were lots of other mothers that are really symbolic in the Afro-Cuban culture. And do you think that they readily found you when you were in Cuba, or do you think that you had been collecting them along the journey of your almost 50 years when you went to Cuba?
Yeah. So I feel you mentioned the Afro-Cuban river deity Oshun. I feel that she had been calling me since I first fell in love with Latin dance, and I was a teenager, and I first heard, the Afro-Cuban rhythms, and something just clicked inside me. I'm this Midwestern girl living in St. Louis, Missouri, where, it's not the center of Afro-Cuban culture at all. But those rhythms, found their way to me, and something came alive in me that I had no words for. And I didn't realize, I wouldn't have made the connection, between, Shun, the river goddess, or any of that. But that love affair with Latin dance became a career, which then took me to Cuba. And the first time I went to Cuba in 2004, I was introduced to the dances that summon. In Santeria, the gods are called orishas. And Santeria is a monotheistic religion. There's one supreme god, Olodumare. But the idea is that that God is too vast for us to comprehend. And so to make things easier on us, there are these intermediary gods known as orishas with whom we can interact, much more easily. And the idea is that each of us have a guardian orisha, one orisha with whom we are significantly aligned in terms of our preferences, the rhythms that we live our life, our loves and our passions, all those things. And that Orisha chooses us. We don't choose the Orisha. They choose us as one of their children. And when I went to Cuba that first time in 2004, I of all the Orisha, it was Oshun that really, really spoke to me. And it was through her dances that I encountered her first. I had gone to work, as I said, with a choreographer there. And we were working on the folkloric dances that can be done performatively, but their origins are in the most sacred dances that are used to actually summon the gods to earth. And so you're dancing, if you're dancing in the steps of Oshun, you're dancing the steps of the river. You're mimicking the movements of the river, and you do that in order to call her forth. And so you're asking me about mothers, but I did that little detour because I just wanted to kind of answer the question about whether they called to me or how they called to me. I feel like it was both a decades-long process and also something that was instantaneous when I went to Cuba and first danced those rhythms, and not only danced them, but saw others dance them in a sacred context in order to summon the gods. And I was able to watch how those dancers' worldly selves just dropped away as they became inhabited by the god or orisha that they were summoning. And that was a pretty big game changer for a dancer that was used to choreographing and curating dances for the stage. In that first trip to Cuba, Oshun was the only mother that I really connected with. And it wasn't until almost a decade later that I encountered in a library book, of all things, information about her Catholic counterpart, Our Lady of Charity. And it really broke things open for me in terms of thinking about the mother and also womanhood, because as we've talked about, in my upbringing, those roles were very rigid. But here was an example in Cuba of a mother that was Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba, a Catholic icon, an incarnation of the Mother Mary, who was also syncretized and held by many, not all Cubans, but by many Cubans, to be really a twin counterpart of Oshun, the Afro-Cuban river deity. And that was a puzzle that I, as someone who had grown up in the U.S. and the Midwest, really had to wrap my brain around, right? Like, I had been taught a woman could be this or she could be that, but here in Cuba was this much more vast template of what a woman and a mother could be, that she could be both Catholic and African. She could be both, a virgin and a river deity and a fertility goddess. And so it was this really expansive notion of who the mother could be that then is replicated, even with Oshun. She comes to her believers and followers in all kinds of guises. She can appear as a young dancer who's very frivolous and very flirtatious, but she can also appear as, a deaf mermaid who weaves at her loom and is very serious, and she can appear as a turkey buzzard, and just all these different roles. And so the mother, what I witnessed in Cuba is much more capacious and appears in many, many, many more guises than what I had witnessed in my own country.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, there was a line in your book that said something about, all the different forms of, mother, daughter, spirit, and that there's this intersection of all the many phases of that form, for lack of a better word. And I thought that really resonated with me, really feeling like, as a mother, as a woman, as a sister, as a daughter, and also as that feminine spirit. I think there's so many different things, and you can't. I think we're as humans, we're always looking to create a pattern or a trend or understand these things, and sometimes there isn't that. You're never going to fully understand, right? Sometimes you understand with your heart, and follow that without trying to look for the something that makes sense to us. And so I really did, I understood it in a way that I'm not articulating very well, but when I read that passage, I thought, yes, I think that's the truth. That's where it is. And it is in trying to understand that we might leave confused. And sometimes you just have to, as you said before, just sit with it and let it just teach you what it's meant to teach you without overthinking it to some way. One thing before we leave your dancing, now your mom and dad were exquisite dancers. Did that did that influence your career in dancing, or do you think that they were two separate things? How do you experience that decision to go into dance?
Yeah, I really feel that I'm the child of both my parents. My dad was this incredibly intuitive dancer. He was just really gifted. He just had that it, whatever that it factor is. And he would just improvise. And everybody, this was back in the days when people still ballroom danced, and there were places where you could go ballroom dancing. And people would clear the floor and just, stare and applaud. And my mother was also, so my mother was a singer and a vocalist, but she was more worried about getting the steps right. She wasn't as comfortable in her body as my father was, improvising things. And so, but they danced all the time. But when my mother got sick with cancer, and I was in high school when she got her diagnosis, my father finally listened to her ongoing request that they take dance lessons together, and they started taking dance lessons. Again, we were in St. Louis, Missouri, so it was a Fred Astaire dance studio where they went to take ballroom dance lessons, and I was a high school student, which meant that I was embarrassed by everything my parents did, and including their ballroom dancing, but I could also see how good it was for my mother. And when they invited me to come watch them dance they were going to dance at Tango Showcase at the Fred Astaire ballroom in St. Louis, and I went, both willingly and unwillingly. I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of lame. This is not cool. But it's important for my parents, so I'm going to show up. And that's when I heard those Latin rhythms for the first time. Not with my parents' dance, but when the professionals came on to dance. And something just really took hold of me then. And what I think, it's only in hindsight that you can see some of the patterns that at the time just feel like life happening to you and washing over you. But I find it curious that in the moment that my mother was dying, she planted the seeds of Latin dance and my love of Latin dance that then led me to a career in Latin dance, that led me to Cuba, which led me to the very traditions and spiritual practices that allowed me to reconnect with her and find her all these years later. And so there's something really beautiful about the arc of that story of dance.
I agree. It's almost like an invisible line that sort of pulling a thread and watching it sort of go through the piece of fabric the way that it does when it is being pulled. It is quite a beautiful reflection, I think, when you look at that tie all the way through. I have to ask you, what was it like being with, if you pronounced it the way it's written, Madeline, with the spiritualist and hearing your mom's voice, what calling your name. Can you put into words what that was like?
Yeah, so the Spiritist in Cuba, there's a religion called Spiritism that, oddly enough, is traces its way back to the French to a man named Allan Kardec, but it's different. It's different and also very similar to the spiritualist movement here in the U.S. In that one of the primary principles or tenets is, the communication with the spirits. And this man, they called him Madeleine, lives in this very small town on the eastern part of the island, El Cobre. And I had heard about him all the way here in Ohio. I had heard that he was the real deal, right? That people in the town called him the real deal. And I really, he was almost an afterthought, or, in terms of this pilgrimage that I set out to find my mother in Cuba, the bigger elements in my mind, the larger elements were, working with Santeria priests, understanding that religion, attending these pilgrimages to Our Lady of Charity's sanctuary. And then I thought, and while I'm there, I'm going to ask the Spiritist of Hill some of my mother's spirit. And I think that I thought of it as an afterthought because I think it was so important to me. It was so important that I couldn't even admit how important it was to me that I would go and ask this man, and that he may or may not, be able to succeed in lifting that veil. And, when you ask about how I feel, when he did indeed, channel my mother's spirit, it felt oddly, it wasn't like there was, like the ground trembled and opened up and everything changed. It felt very calm. It felt so ordinary. And I think in that ordinariness, it felt so much more impactful because she spoke my childhood name. She didn't call me by, I go by Rebi, that's my author name, and that's what my friends call me. But for decades, I've been Rebecca professionally, and no one calls me Becky. And here I was in this very, very small, isolated mountain town with a man who doesn't speak English and doesn't know a lot of Americans, and would have been very difficult for him to know that Becky is a nickname for Rebecca. And that had been the name my mother had called me. And so there was something so ordinary and so profound. It was just this very gentle calling of my childhood name. It was really beautiful.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine that it was. And what was it like for you after all the years of craving to reconnect with your mother? What was it like in that moment? Was it it sounds like it was beautiful and it was everything you wanted, but was there any other emotion, fear or exhilaration or anything in those that you would name, or was it just a quiet hearing of your name?
Yeah, it's really hard to answer that correctly because I think there were so many emotions that were going on in that room. We had spent 4 or 5 hours working on summoning my mother's spirit. So it wasn't like just this in a flash, I went in and this happened. And in that, the whole experience was really disorienting, right? Because I had never been to see a spiritist in Cuba before, and I wasn't familiar with the rituals, and I wanted so badly for it to work. So I was so invested in understanding and being part of it. So it was exhausting, right? It was exhausting, and it was a lot. And you're in Cuba where it's hot. It's so hot, especially in that part of the island, and so. You're almost in another state, right? I think the biggest surprise for me was the experiences I had in Cuba, and I feel like a portal opened for me during that time there because the things that I was invited to witness and participate in, and the things that I share with my reader in the book are are pretty extraordinary, and it feels like a lot of doors really opened for me. And so I witnessed some profound things, and I went through some profound experiences, but really the most profound experience was then bringing all that home with me and having to say out loud to the people that I love here, there's this other way that I saw, about how to live one's life and how to connect with the dead. And I'm bringing home these beliefs that may feel very strange to some of the people here in my Midwestern life, but I'm going to hold on to those for everything that I'm worth, because they changed me profoundly. And if I turn my back on them, then they don't exist anymore, right? Like, so there was something very profound about coming back to the ordinary and carrying my mother and the practice of speaking to my mother here once I was back. That was really the most profound part of the whole journey.
And the way you close your book is about there's a word for your partner or the individual in your life, and you had to do sort of a ritual with him in a river, which seems very ordinary, but yet connects to all the water in the world in certain ways. And so there's that interconnectedness again. And I'm curious about how that, not final piece, but one of the many pieces towards the end of your journey and your sort of reintegrating with your ordinary life in the Midwest. What was that like for you and your partner, and how did that impact or change the relationship that you had before you left for Cuba?
Yeah. So I had been really, and I talk about this in the book, in my Mother in Havana, I talk about the whole time I was in Cuba. One of my reference points for everything that I was experiencing there was, what would Rick think? I had been in this relationship for a year at the time that I went to Cuba for the experiences that I write about in the book. And I knew that it was potentially an important relationship, but we weren't so comfortable with one another yet that I would know how he would react to anything. And he's a very linear, analytical, I believe what I can see and touch. And I mean, that was his go-to mode. And so it kind of gave me this thing to bounce against as I was experiencing all these things in Cuba, because, and again, it gets back to that feminist thread in the book. I had been so used my whole life to wanting to please others, especially men, right? Not wanting to be hysterical, not wanting to be one of those out there kind of, women. And I had to really confront that. I had to confront that within myself. Like, do I want to go back and pretend to be a woman who I think this partner might want me to be, or am I going to go back and like really just share exactly who I am? And so there was a real beauty and power in that. When I came home, I unpacked my suitcase and I showed Rick the things that I brought home with him, and I told them what they meant. So the Spiritist had given me a very important artifact. I had undergone some initiations in Santeria, and I brought back those artifacts. And I said, look, I don't expect you to believe in this. I'm not asking you to believe in it or participate in it with me, but I need you to know that these things are absolutely sacred to me. And the experiences I had there are untouchable. And the experience I had with Madeline speaking my childhood name, you can think of inside your head all the things, all the possible rational explanations for that. And that's fine. You don't have to believe it, but you can't out loud challenge me about it, right? Like, you have to respect that these things are so deeply, profoundly important to me. There was such a power in speaking that, and then such a beauty in his response, which was, okay, right? I get it. These things are absolutely inviolable to you, and And then, as icing on the cake, Madeline, the spiritist, had given me instructions to go to a river with my pantalon, my partner, and bathe ourselves in honey and coconut and toss offerings of sunflowers and honey and coconut into the river and ask for the blessings of the spiritual mothers, Oshun, on our partnership. And so, it seemed perfectly reasonable when I was with Madeline, and then I had to come home and tell my Rick, hey, what do you think about going to the river and doing all this? And he was so tentative about it. It was so outside his comfort zone, but he went. And it's one of my favorite chapters of the book. I had so much fun writing it because he really rose to the challenge in all of his discomfort. I mean, he was so out of his comfort zone, and yet in it to win it, as he would say, in it there with me. And ever since then, he's been to Cuba with me 4 times now. And we were married in Cuba, in El Cobre, just outside Our Lady of Charity's sanctuary. So he's come a long way. He says to me at the river that he thanks me for putting him in an uncomfortable position where he has to grow because he likes that.
Yes, well, congratulations to you and Rick. That's the perfect ending to this story. Because, it is true, and I had mentioned to you that my husband is very similar, very analytic. I'll be interested to hear his thoughts after he edits this podcast, because he always shares with me his 2 cents. And I think it's going to be interesting to hear seeing himself in Rick and sort of feeling like, some of the things that I come up with, and I say, you got to, just because you can't explain it doesn't mean it's not real. And who are we to judge, right? Different cultures, different people have different traditions that in our sphere of experience we can't explain. It doesn't mean that it's any less real to them. And that's a stretch for somebody who likes to see and feel and touch and explain and rationalize and justify based on facts. And so it is a contradiction of terms, but Dan as well, over the last 25 years, has become a little bit softer, specifically maybe more towards me than the way he sees the world, but definitely understanding that, he sort of he has to let me stay in my lane, and that we're not going to be in the same lane all the time, kind of a thing. And that's where I think relationships are important and magical, because you have to let things that you believe in go for the other person. And that is the sacrifice that, maybe that's the only way, getting back to mothering, that a man can actually feel like what it's like to be a mom. Because as a mother, we sacrifice everything for our children and would do anything for the people that we love in a way that maybe they don't understand. And this is one way for them to understand that, maybe you have to let go of all logic when you are with me in this space, and that's okay. That's okay for you to delve into that space every once in a while and experience what that's like, because it's good for all of us to be uncomfortable, because only growth comes from discomfort, right? In my past life, I was a therapist, and I know a lot about how doctors think about women being hysterical and the rough road that women have had in terms of finding their voice and their path. And you do that so beautifully through this book. I mean, this book is really a treasure. And as I find different rituals and, different storylines, there was a part in the book that you said in the movies and in mainstream media, the practices that you embarked on in Cuba, I'm going to say it wrong, Santeria, is seen to be demonic at times, and the dancing and the blood and the animal sacrifice, and this gave me a very different perspective of it. And in the future, I will look at it with not the full meaning that you have, because I'm sure every movement has meaning, but definitely with a kind of reverence that I wouldn't have had before, because everybody's rituals are meaningful to them. And for those of us who are observers, the least we can do is let them be and give tribute to what they believe in. And so I really, really do appreciate that. As we close out this interview, because we have been at it for a little bit, I want to ask you, what did you hope to deliver to the readers of My Mother in Havana? And what do you hope that people walk away from? Because I feel different after reading it. But what was your intent? Because I think intention is so important for the universe. What was your intent in putting this beautiful book out there in the memory of your mother?
I think my intention was to understand these really unanswerable questions, right? What is the mother? How do we connect with her when our own mother is gone? What is this thing, called mother, when it transcends our biological version of her? And then also, how do we connect with someone who's gone, right? Is the way we're taught to grieve in this country really, the right way or not? So I had some very deep personal questions, and it took me a good 6 or 7 years to write the book. And then another couple of years after that, on the road to publication. But, looking at it now is very different, right? Because I created something, in answering those questions, I created a path for my reader that I think can be, multifaceted. One is, the subtitle of the book is a memoir of magic and miracle, and I know that not all my readers are ready to sign up for magic and miracle, right? I want Dan to read my book. I want people who don't use that language, ordinarily, to also feel comfortable. So I really wanted to walk my reader through each of these experiences. We kind of knock on the door between life and death, and is there something behind this door? So that's one of the things that I want for my readers is I wanted to walk them through that experience and give my reader the opportunity to ask those questions for themselves and think about those things. So my Mother in Havana is for those readers. It's a love letter for myself, the 19-year-old version of myself who lost my mother, and for the 50-year-old version of myself that still missed her. But it's a love letter to the reader who wants to reconnect with or is looking to connect with their own lost beloved. It's also a love letter to anybody who wants to kind of explore this question of who we are as women and as mothers. And is there a guide out there? It's a love letter to the guides that might be out there, waiting to show each of us, our way in a world that can sometimes feel very mysterious and puzzling and troubling, right? Who is there a mother out there? Is there somebody listening to our deepest and most urgent cries? And I believe that there is. But yeah, so I think there are several paths for the reader. I also think there's a path for a reader that's just interested in Cuba and what's it like in Cuba and how hot is it and what is Havana like and what is El Cobre like on that level. Yeah. How did it resonate for you? If I can put you on the spot.
No, thank you. No, thank you. I think it achieved what you said. I love a book that is provocative, that forces me to continue thinking about it after it's done and make me push myself to explore things that I don't like to think about. And so I think that you can check that off. It did that for me. I love where I can sit in somewhere where I don't know the answers. It's uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's also very comforting to know that we don't have to have all the answers. As a therapist and as a studier of human behavior, I like to I like to think that I know what makes people tick. I like to know why people behave the way that they do, and that's not really true. I think my job, or as I was a guide to certain people, was to help shine some light on some of the choices they made and their behaviors and where that comes from. That was an important part of, I think, people who come to therapy to try to understand what makes them behave in the ways that they do. But I also really love reflection. I think that this book is made me think a lot about my mom and my relationship with my mother and how I said goodbye to her, and was I comfortable in that moment, and the fact that I've always believed I can talk to my mom and dad, and so I do quite often, but I think that this just gave me more knowing that that's real and that's good and that that's okay, and also probably something to pass on to my daughter, that I will always be with her, and that whenever she needs me, all she needs to do is think about me. And so I think that it made me look backwards, it made me look forward, and it was just a very beautiful experience, and I can't thank you enough for taking what was a very personal journey and a emotional and probably in many ways, not smooth sailing, very traumatic and a roller coaster ride, and creating a very beautiful piece of art in this book to help, because your writing was beautiful. I don't want to miss saying that. I thought the writing, the imagery, the way you spoke about your love for Cuba was clear. And it's a beautiful piece of writing you should be very proud of. And I'm really glad that it took you decades to do it, but that it reached its goal. And for every one of us who's lucky enough to read it, that we will not be unchanged by it. So thank you very much, Rebi, for putting this work together, for putting it out in the universe, and for taking this time to talk to me about it. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Jojy. It's been such a pleasure talking about My Mother in Havana with you and your listeners. I really appreciate it.